Have you ever watched someone try to take everything from a person who had already lost so much? That was exactly what happened on a quiet spring morning in Willow Creek, a small suburban community where most residents knew each other by name. At the center of the storm was 78-year-old Margaret Wilson. Margaret had lived in the same modest white house for nearly 50 years. She had raised 3 children there. She had cared for her husband Robert through a long battle with cancer. And 2 years earlier, she had buried him. Since then, the little house had become more than a home. It was the last place where she still felt close to him. Every flower in the garden had been planted by Robert. Every room carried a memory. Every morning Margaret sat on the front porch with a cup of coffee and spoke softly to a framed photograph of her late husband. Life was simple, quiet, lonely sometimes, but peaceful, until Karen Mitchell became president of the HOA. Karen was 52, ambitious, and obsessed with control. She believed the neighborhood should look perfect. Perfect lawns, perfect fences, perfect houses. And in Karen's eyes, Margaret's property was becoming a problem. The old widow could no longer maintain the yard the way she once had. A few bushes had grown uneven. The fence needed paint. Several flower beds looked wild compared to the manicured landscaping Karen preferred. Most neighbors didn't care. In fact, many quietly helped Margaret. But Karen cared. A lot. Over the course of 6 months, Margaret received warning letter after warning letter. The first complained about overgrown flowers. The second claimed the fence violated HOA appearance standards. The third demanded landscaping improvements. Then came fines. $100, $200, $500. Margaret was living on a fixed retirement income. Each letter caused her anxiety. Each fine forced difficult choices. Medicine or HOA payment. Groceries or HOA payment. One afternoon, Margaret gathered her courage and attended an HOA meeting. She stood slowly and addressed the board. "I'll do my best," she said softly. "My husband passed away. I can't do all the work myself anymore." Several residents nodded sympathetically. Karen didn't. Instead, she opened a folder. "The rules apply equally to everyone," Karen replied. "No compassion, no flexibility, no understanding." Margaret left the meeting in tears. What nobody knew was that Karen had a larger plan. A plan she had discussed privately with 2 board members. The widow's property sat on one of the largest lots in the neighborhood. A developer had recently expressed interest in purchasing adjacent land. Property values were rising, and Karen believed Margaret's home represented an opportunity. An opportunity Margaret didn't even know existed. Weeks later, the letters became more aggressive. Karen claimed years of accumulated violations had created substantial HOA debt. Margaret was confused. The numbers didn't make sense. She called the HOA office repeatedly. Her calls went unanswered. She sent written requests asking for detailed records. No response. Then one morning, a certified letter arrived. Margaret's hands shook as she opened it. According to the document, the HOA intended to pursue legal action regarding unpaid assessments and violations. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, staring at the pages. She felt sick. She had never been sued, never missed important payments, never caused trouble. Yet somehow she was being treated like a criminal. That evening, her daughter Susan drove over immediately after receiving a distressed phone call. Susan reviewed the paperwork carefully. Something felt wrong. The figures seemed inflated. Some violations appeared duplicated. Several charges lacked supporting documentation. "This doesn't look right, Mom," Susan said. But proving it would be difficult. The HOA had attorneys. Margaret had limited savings. Over the following weeks, pressure increased. Karen began conducting frequent inspections. Neighbors noticed. Some felt uncomfortable. Others became angry. Several residents privately approached Karen and suggested she leave the widow alone. Karen dismissed them. "The community standards must be enforced," she insisted. But people were beginning to suspect this wasn't really about standards. It felt personal. Then came the morning that changed everything. Margaret awoke to the sound of vehicles outside. She looked through her front window and froze. Several trucks were parked near her property. 2 HOA representatives stood beside Karen. A contractor was speaking with them while pointing towards sections of Margaret's yard. Confused and frightened, Margaret stepped outside. "What is happening?" she asked. Karen handed her a document. According to Karen, the HOA had authorized corrective action on the property due to unresolved violations. The costs would be added to Margaret's account. Margaret stared at the paperwork. thousands of dollars in additional charges. Her knees nearly buckled. This wasn't enforcement anymore. This felt like a takeover. Several neighbors emerged from their homes. Whispers spread quickly. People began gathering along the street. Nobody had ever seen anything like this. Margaret looked around helplessly. Then she saw something that made her heart sink even further. A county deputy had arrived. The deputy wasn't there to arrest anyone. He was present merely to keep the peace. But seeing a law enforcement vehicle outside her home terrified Margaret. For the first time since Robert's death, she genuinely feared losing the house. The house they had built together. The house filled with nearly 50 years of memories. As the crowd grew larger, Karen appeared confident, almost triumphant. She believed everything was finally falling into place. What Karen didn't know was that hidden inside Margaret's home sat an old wooden box. A box her late husband had protected for decades. And inside that box was a document capable of destroying Karen's entire plan. As neighbors gathered along the street, 78-year-old Margaret Wilson stood trembling on her front porch. The HOA contractors waited. The deputy watched quietly. Karen Mitchell stood with her arms folded, looking completely confident. To everyone watching, it seemed as though the battle was already over. Margaret looked helpless. A grieving widow. An aging homeowner. One woman against an entire HOA. That was exactly what Karen wanted everyone to believe. But inside the house, something important was about to change everything. Margaret's daughter Susan suddenly remembered a conversation she had years earlier with her father. Robert Wilson had always been organized. Painfully organized. He saved every receipt, every property record, every tax statement, and every legal document he ever received. Shortly before his death, he had told Susan something she had almost forgotten. If anyone ever questions this property, he had said, look in the cedar box. At the time, Susan thought nothing of it. Now those words came rushing back. Mom, Susan said suddenly. The cedar box. Margaret's eyes widened. The cedar box. For decades it had sat untouched in the hall closet. Within minutes, Susan rushed inside and retrieved it. The box was old. Dust covered the corners. Inside were dozens of carefully organized folders. Property records. Tax documents, survey maps, correspondence. Then Susan found a sealed envelope. Across the front, written in Robert's handwriting, were 6 simple words. Important property records, do not discard. Susan opened it. Her eyes widened immediately. Then she looked at Margaret. Then back at the document. Something was very wrong. Outside, Karen was becoming impatient. She informed the contractors to prepare for work. Several neighbors began protesting. Many felt the situation had gone too far. One resident started recording with his phone. Another called the local county property office seeking clarification. Karen didn't care. She believed she had all the authority she needed. Then Susan stepped outside carrying the envelope. Before anybody touches this property, she said loudly. Everyone needs to see this. The crowd became silent. Even the deputy paid attention. Susan handed copies of several documents to the deputy. One document immediately stood out. It was an official property survey approved by the county nearly 20 years earlier. The survey directly contradicted multiple HOA claims. The areas Karen claimed violated HOA boundaries weren't HOA property at all. They belonged entirely to Margaret. But that wasn't the biggest surprise. A second document revealed something even more serious. Years earlier, when the neighborhood HOA was first established, Robert Wilson had negotiated a unique legal agreement concerning his lot. The agreement had been officially recorded with the county. It granted the Wilson property exemptions from several HOA enforcement provisions because the property predated portions of the development. The exemption had never been revoked. It was still valid. Karen had either failed to research it or ignored it completely. The deputy carefully reviewed the paperwork. Then he reviewed the HOA documents. His expression changed. What exactly is going on here, he asked. For the first time all morning, Karen looked nervous. The deputy explained that the documents raised significant questions about the HOA's authority. He advised everyone to stop immediately until the matter could be verified. The contractors wasted no time. Within minutes, they packed their equipment and left. No one wanted involvement in a potential legal dispute. Karen's face turned red. But the worst was still coming. The county property office returned a neighbor's call later that afternoon. The employee confirmed that the exemption agreement appeared legitimate. The following day, Susan hired an attorney specializing in property disputes. Unlike the HOA's attorney, this lawyer had extensive experience dealing with overreaching associations. Within a week, he uncovered a disturbing pattern. Several violation notices issued to Margaret contained inaccuracies. Some fines appeared duplicated. Certain charges lacked supporting inspection reports. Other penalties had never been properly approved by the HOA board. The deeper he looked, the worse things became. Then came the discovery that changed everything. Email records obtained during the investigation revealed internal discussions among HOA leadership. Those messages suggested Karen had repeatedly pushed aggressive action against Margaret despite concerns from other board members. One email was particularly damaging. In it, Karen described Margaret's property as an obstacle to future development opportunities. The message shocked everyone. This wasn't about community standards. This wasn't about lawn maintenance. This wasn't about rules. It was about control, and possibly money. News spread quickly throughout Willow Creek. Neighbors who had remained silent finally spoke up. Several residents submitted written statements describing similar experiences. Others revealed they had previously warned Karen that her actions toward Margaret were excessive. One former board member even disclosed that concerns about Margaret's age and financial limitations had been openly discussed during meetings. Public opinion shifted rapidly. People who once avoided HOA meetings suddenly began attending. Attendance reached record levels. Residents demanded answers. Karen struggled to defend herself. Every explanation created more questions. Every statement revealed new inconsistencies. Then came the annual HOA election. For years, Karen had controlled nearly every major decision. She expected another easy victory. Instead, homeowners showed up in overwhelming numbers. Many had never voted before. They remembered Margaret. They remembered the property rate. They remembered seeing an elderly widow standing alone on her porch while officials prepared to act against her home. The result wasn't close. Karen lost her position. Several board members resigned shortly afterward. A complete review of HOA procedures was launched. Many disputed fines were canceled. New transparency policies were introduced. And special protections were established for elderly homeowners facing hardship situations. As for Margaret, the legal action against her was withdrawn. Every improper charge disappeared. The threat against her home ended completely. Months later, life returned to normal. The flowers still grew in Robert's garden. The White House still stood. And every morning, Margaret sat on the front porch with a cup of coffee, just as she always had. One afternoon, a neighbor asked how she managed to stay so strong through everything. Margaret smiled softly. Then she looked toward the flower beds her husband had planted decades earlier. "I wasn't fighting for a house," she said. "I was fighting for the life we built inside it." The neighbor nodded, because everyone understood exactly what she meant. A home isn't just wooden walls. It's memories. It's family. It's love. And sometimes, the people who appear the weakest are the ones who have the strongest reasons to stand their ground. Karen had seen an elderly widow living alone. What she failed to see was 50 years of history, determination, and truth standing behind that front door. And in the end, one forgotten document didn't just save a home. It exposed a plan that should never have existed in the first place.